Hello, colleagues and friends. Welcome back to the training session on land governance in support of agricultural transformation in Africa. I hope all of you are safe in the context of this pandemic. The previous module, module 1, took us through an overview of the conceptual and theoretical framework on land governance. Key messages from module 1 included that land has multifaceted dimensions, so it can be studied from different disciplines' perspectives. Therefore, we showed that it is important to be open to an interdisciplinary approach of land. We also looked at the colonial land policy legacy because it shaped deeply the land governance issues in our continent. And finally, we went through the commitment, the key commitment of the African leadership, which is AU Agenda 2063, as it has important implications in terms of land governance. Well, now we are moving toward module 2. Module 2 is about key land issues in Africa. Let me go through the key objectives of the module. The key objective of this module is to make participants aware of the regional specificities related to land issues in our continent, to highlight common land issues, using them as a basis for future mutual learning and experience sharing. A third objective is to undertake a reflection on selected emerging land issues. Then, last objective is to prepare participants to reflect on land policy perspectives. Let's see the content of this module. 1, we look at the methodology for identifying key land issues. 2, we look at communalities in terms of land issues in the continent. 3, we look at regional specificities in terms of land issues. And 4, we'll have a look at certain emerging land issues. Let me go straight to the content. First part, the methodology for identifying key land issues in Africa. You see this slide, which is giving a picture of the arable land potential of Africa. You see that from all regions, West Africa, Southern Africa, Northern Africa, from all regions, there is a potential of arable land. So the continent has a huge potential of arable lands. From that data that we have, mainly from FAO, we know that 60% of uncultivated arable lands in the world are in Africa. But the real land policy question is the following. How can the potential of land be transformed into wealth and benefit African people? I would say that responding to this question, one size does not fit all, meaning that we cannot take a solution from another part of the world and just come and try to implement it in Africa. All mimetic approaches in terms of land policy development and implementation failed. This is important to understand. The thing is that land policy development and implementation is about finding solutions to specific land problems in Africa. Let's think of how a medical doctor is treating disease. He will start by establishing a clear diagnostic before giving a prescription. I would say that we can really compare this approach with what policymakers, land policymakers need to do. First, they need to identify key land issues. That's the diagnostic. Then, based on the identification of key land issues, they need to formulate land policy responses. That's the prescription. So, the starting point should be always to respond to the following question. What are the concrete, the specific problems, land problems, which need to be addressed? Establishing a clear land diagnostic brings a major challenge. The challenge of data. We know that accessing data in Africa is really a big challenge. So to conclude on this slide, I would say that land policy is about finding solutions to problems. It's not about finding problems to ready-made solutions. You understand what I mean here. What I mean is that you cannot just take a ready-made solution from wherever in the world and come and ask African governments or African people to just implement it. We need to develop homegrown solutions to specific African land problems. We also need to understand that participation is key. Addressing key land issues is not just about technical expertise. You need to take into consideration the diversity of legitimate interests in land. For example, clearly, the state has interests in land. The private sector has interests in land, but let's also think that local communities also have interests in land. So their voice needs to be heard. The other reason for having a participatory approach is balancing power inequalities. Some stakeholders are very powerful, so their voice will be heard. Unfortunately, some other stakeholders have less power and their voice might not be heard in the debate, in the policy debate. So identifying key land issues is really a prerequisite for any land policy process. Identifying key land issues is very challenging. Some of the challenges include the following. First, there is a variety of land issues across Africa, meaning that this diversity is a real challenge. You have a diversity within the same country, but you also have a diversity across the continent. We have 55 AU member states. If we consider that even within the same country, land issues can be so diverse, what would it be at the level of the continent with 55 AU member states? So it's a real challenge, the diversity of issues. Another element is that land policies are developed and implemented at national level. So it can be challenging from a continental perspective to reflect on key land issues in our continent. We know that the principle of sovereignty and equal sovereignty of member states is a very important principle from the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Therefore, the focus of the land reform will vary according to the prominent social, political, national context. This being said, it is still possible to have a coherent perception of land issues in Africa. This coherent approach, this coherent perception can be achieved through identifying commonalities on the one hand and regional specificities on the other hand. It's important to acknowledge that despite the diversity of realities in Africa, there is a lot in common. We share a lot in common. And the other element I would also raise is that there is a huge interest of AU member states for exchange of experiences, lesson learning, and experience sharing. So this diversity is not just a challenge, it's also an opportunity for learning from each other. Another aspect of challenges is about resources. We know that human resources need to be mobilized in the context of multidisciplinary teams. But we know that in certain areas, Africa has limited expertise. So the human resource element can be a major challenge. The financial resource is also a major challenge. We all know that there is poor budgetary allocation to national land policy processes, and that African government used to rely mainly on donor funds. Really, this is a paradox because we know that land is a source of wealth. At the same time, we are not able to mobilize and generate resources to fund our own land policy processes. It's really a paradox. The other challenge, I mentioned it before, is about limited availability of data. We all know that there is a culture of secrecy in most African public administration. Sometimes it's even easier for a foreign expert to come within the continent, within a country, and gather data, while at national level, it can be very difficult to access the same data. Even when the data is available, it's poorly managed. So it's difficult to generate knowledge from this data because it's poorly managed. It's there, but you won't be able to access it because it's not managed, organized. I think that time is also a major challenge when it comes to land policy. Usually there is a very negative perception of the significant amount of time which is required to conduct a solid study on land issues. Establishing a national land diagnostic is time-consuming. It requires that you go gather data, that you conduct analysis, and so on. And it takes time. While we know that decision makers are often under pressure by forthcoming elections or by land social movements, so they want to go very fast, while land policy process require that we take time to do certain important things. We also know that multi-stakeholder consultations are required for sound land policy process, but they are also very time-consuming and even costly. They are also costly. So these are some of the challenges we need to keep in mind when thinking of identifying land issues. Here you have an example of agro-climatic zoning in Burkina Faso, but it could be any other country. You see that from this map, we identify 3 agro-climatic zones in Burkina. We have the Sahelian part. We have what we call the Sudan Sahelian part at the center, and we have what we call the Sudanian climate part in the western part and southern part of the country. This is a way of looking at the context of Burkina, but we see that it's possible also to move toward another approach, what we call social-spatial zoning. The social-spatial zoning will try to combine other information, not only the climatic dimension, but add other information like population dynamics, the migration movement, the priority land uses, and identify key land challenges and map key land challenges. For example, on this map, you can see that in the northern part, the main challenges are related to pastoral land use. In the western part of Burkina, you will see that there is there are issues related to migration, for example. In the central part, we will see that very overpopulated areas with a lot of competition and conflict can be considered as an area. So it's a way of looking at key land issues, organizing them through socio-spatial zoning. So it's a very important and interesting approach to take beyond just looking at climatic zones. What ALPC LPI did to identify key land issues in Africa was to go first by region, developing regional studies and moving from the regional level to the continental level. The LPI partnered with the regional economic communities to conduct studies on land issues in each region. You have LPI has conducted studies in Southern Africa, land issues in Southern Africa, land issues in Eastern Africa, land issues in Central Africa, land issues in Northern Africa, and land issues in West Africa. So all the regions have been documented in terms of land issues. From this regional perspective, it was then possible to identify where are the communalities, meaning issues which are common to all African countries, and then identify specificities, meaning issues which are really characteristic to certain regions, issues which are prominent in certain regions. And it made it also possible to discuss and identify some of the emerging land issues. So this is the approach, the very interesting approach of ALPC. And I think you can also apply it to a national level. You can take your country, look at the different regional areas, and look at the key issues in each of the regions. Then you can identify communalities at national level. Then you can highlight specificities in certain regional specificities within the country. So it's a really very interesting approach and promising approach. Here you have the map which shows the different regions. We all know that Africa, from the AU perspective, Africa has 5 key regions, while here it's mentioned the 6 regions. It's because the AU has just decided to add a 6th region, which is the diaspora. We might think that, okay, the diaspora is not in Africa, so it has nothing to do with land issues. But in fact, we need to think differently, because the diaspora still have interest in land in the continent for the purpose of developing investment, or just for just because they are very focused on the family land and the cultural dimension of the land. So it's very important to also think of the implications of the diaspora when we discuss land issues. I'm giving you here an example drawn from few countries, land policy processes in few countries, how they have been able to identify the key land issues. Usually, first step is to identify a country expert team, national expert team. Then to establish a steering committee of the process. Second step could be to engage research institutions in developing the study on key land issues. Because it's very important to engage those institutions, because they have already done research. They have results that can be used to identify and discuss and analyze key land issues. For sure, literature review is to be undertaken, because you have to start by what you know through scientific papers, working papers, and other studies. Then you'll try to see what you don't know and try to collect additional information and additional data. It's important to think that the sources are so diverse. You can find sources of information with research institutions, but you'll also find with development partners, you'll find with NGOs, farmers organizations, and so on. So it's important to understand that the source of knowledge is very diverse. Otherwise, you might miss very, very important data and information. Regional consultations is also very important when it comes to identifying and discussing key land issues. Even if your team of experts is very strong and very knowledgeable, it's important to have feedback from stakeholders. Some issues are best known by stakeholders on the ground, or some other issues are not documented yet, but they are very well known at local level. So the feedback of stakeholders is important, and you can have it through regional consultations. Then you'll end with developing a report on key land issues. It has to be a quality report. Remember that we call this a diagnostic of land issues. If your diagnostic is wrong or weak, you might be misled to some wrong policy options and directions. So it's very important to have a quality report on key land issues. So now let's look at commonalities in terms of key land issues in Africa. Remember that even during the first module, we looked at the colonial history of Africa. The whole Africa has been colonized, and we are dealing with a persisting influence of the colonial legacy, even today. The colonial history, the colonization of Africa took place in the 19th century, but we are still suffering the legacy, the negative legacy of this colonial period. Africa was colonized by different European powers. We all know that colonization is about first territorial occupation. Usually it's done through military conquest. Second, colonization is also about political domination of the people. The colonial powers have established colonial administration in order to govern the people. And three, colonization is about economic exploitation of the conquered territories. So these are the three dimensions of colonization: territorial occupation, political domination, and economic exploitation. We all know that the colonial powers were diverse. They were mainly European powers. We had France, we had Britain, we had Germany, we had Portugal, Belgium, Italy. And exception, which we can mention, is about Ethiopia and Liberia, who were never colonized. It's important to have to keep in mind those colonial powers, because they have brought different types of land administration systems in the continent. So it's important to keep in mind that Africa was dominated by France, by Britain, by Germany, and others. I think that we also discussed how the domination of the African continent was vital to the European countries. In the 19th century, Europe was in vital need to supply its industries with minerals and agricultural raw materials. So they needed to conquest the African continent, new territories, and provide opportunities for control and access to natural resources, which were hosted by the continent. Let's take two examples. The French colonization, for example, focused on cash crop production for export in West Africa. Then it focused on logging and mining in Central Africa. The British and German colonization took place mainly in Southern Africa and also in Eastern Africa, and it was dedicated for settlement of the European people. And in Southern Africa, it was done through the apartheid system. And it led to the creation of large farms and parks. So these are examples of how the different colonial powers behaved in Africa when it comes to land. This slide is just showing you the process of conquest, of territorial occupation of the African continent. You can see that by end of 19th century, very few countries were, very few territories were occupied. Then by 1914, quite the whole continent was colonized. You can see in West Africa and part of Northern Africa that the French power were dominant, and you can see in Eastern and Southern Africa that the British colonization was dominant. Then you have other colonial powers. For example, you have the Belgium in Congo, you have the Portuguese in Angola, Mozambique, and very, very enigmatic colonial powers, which are, for example, Spain, which was mainly in Equatorial Guinea and part of the so-called Spanish Sahara. Let's have a look at how the colonial land administration system operated in Africa. The colonial land administration system was based on key principles. One of them is the non-recognition of customary land rights. Let's remember that the majority of lands in Africa are held and used through customary land systems. The colonial land administration decided not to recognize the customary land rights, meaning that it's a negation of the denial of the rights of the majority of African people. Another key principle, which is called in French terre vacante et sans maître, meaning vacant and I would say untitled lands, was used as a basis for constituting the colonial state land domain, meaning that any land which is not used, currently used, or any land which is not held through a title is considered as part of the colonial state land domain. You can see how such a principle can be really bad for African landowners, because we know that not all the land is used at the same time. You'll use the land in a manner that you leave part of it to regenerate while you are putting under exploitation part of your land holding. So if the land is not occupied currently, the colonial administration considered that it's a vacant land. Let's take another example. Pastoral lands are not obviously seen as developed land, are used land. So most pastoral lands were considered as vacant land and then therefore integrated into the colonial state land domain. A third principle in the land administration system is that it's considered that land property doesn't exist in African traditional cultures. Therefore, property is created by the colonial state, only by the colonial state. As a result, the land owned by the African people are not considered as their property rights, because it was not allocated to them as land property by the colonial state. So it's all those principles which have really guided the land administration, the colonial land administration system. As a result, the colonial land system marginalized the majority of African people. You can see that even when it was said that African people could claim their land right, their legitimate land rights, very few people decided to go and ask for a land title or a land certificate from the colonial land administration, because people couldn't understand why they should go to the colonial administration to get their land right acknowledged, land right that they have been holding for generations, for centuries. So people couldn't understand that. So they just didn't make use of the system which was sometimes designed for them. The other consequence of the land administration system is a very, very limited implementation of the land registration system. The system was used mainly by the colonial companies and the African elites, which was tied to the colonial system. There were few attempts to put in place mechanisms for the recognition of customary land rights, but they were really never completed. They were never made effective on the ground. Let me give you one example of how the colonial system was established. The colonial land system was established in Africa through the French colonial system. The French colonial system was a specific system designed for colonial territories. The system was imported from Australia through a law called the Torrens Act. The Torrens Act was adopted in 1858 in Australia. So the French colonial power found that it might be more adapted to African territories. The law is called the Torrens Act because it was created by the General Register of Australia, which was named Robert Torrens. The Torrens system was imposed in all French colonial territories in early 20th century, meaning starting from 1900. It was implemented in Northern Africa, meaning Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. It was also implemented in what was called the French Western Africa, which is roughly the French-speaking countries in West Africa, and also in part of Central Africa. Let me tell you about some of the principles behind the French land registration system. The first principle is that any land user has to apply for a land title. So you are not recognized land ownership, you have to apply for ownership. Remember, I told you that land property is considered as created by the state. So you have to apply for the registration of your land. Then the system goes to first a kind of physical identification of the land, meaning the demarcation of the land. But it has to be a very precise land demarcation done by a surveyor. The second type of identification is the legal identification. Each land is allocated a unique identification number. So this will be the identification, the legal identification of that piece of land. Then you have a kind of investigation on the ground, kind of a land adjudication process on the ground. And finally, the land title will be issued. So these are the key principles of the French land administration, colonial land administration system. In a nutshell, let's say that first you start with a written application, then this application is published, then potential claims are received and recorded. The land is demarcated and given this physical identity. Any land dispute has to be settled. Then you move to the implementation of the registration formalities, which include allocating this unique identification number. And that's how you reach to the issuance of the land title. When you look at the procedure like this, it can be, you can think that, this is not that difficult. But in fact, it can take months, if not years, to be completed. So it's a very long and difficult procedure. Let me move now to another common issue across Africa. This is the legal and institutional pluralism in the land sector. In fact, this legal and institutional pluralism is also a result of the colonial domination. What is legal pluralism? Legal pluralism can be considered as the presence in a social field of more than one legal order. This is a definition by Griffith. As I told you already, it is associated with the colonial legacy. The colonial system was proposed with traditional African systems, and it led to legal pluralism, plurality of norms and orders within the same social field. Pluralism is also about institutions. The colonial land administration institutions were superposed with already existing traditional land institutions. We all know that in any African society, you have the land chief, you have the village chief, you have the forest chief, and others. So those institutions continue to exist. But in addition, you have the colonial land administration institutions which have been superposed to the existing system. In practice, legal pluralism is an opposition between the statutory law and the customary law. But in some other cases, it also involves the Sharia law or some other local practices which have been invented by local communities. Legal pluralism also question the issue of legality versus the issue of legitimacy. Legality is what is in accordance with the law, while legitimacy is what is in accordance with the perception and beliefs of the people. Some of the implications of the legal pluralism in the land sector include the following. In most cases, the statutory land laws are not effective on the ground.